The United States would suffer another shock when, on October the 1st, 1949, they learned that Mao Zedong's communists had defeated the American-backed nationalist forces in China.
The communists under Mao touched something very deep in the peasantry, fought a brilliant fight. You have the Russians getting the atomic weapon, China has fallen. There's no doubt that there was a sense in many quarters that we were in a titanic struggle.
The struggle erupted on June the 25th, 1950, when North Korea, supported by both the Soviet Union and China, attacked the South. An American-led army under the auspices of the newly formed United Nations was rushed in to resist them.
The three nations have now made it clear that lawless aggression will be met with force.
So once again, a wartime draft interrupted American lives. Men were torn from their families and sent to the other side of the world. World War II vet Len Mattioli had been enjoying the sun-baked California good life. By November of 1950, he was fighting North Korean and Communist Chinese soldiers at Korea's Chosin Reservoir.
The Chinese were all over us. We just mowed them down. And it was just hard to believe that they would just keep coming like that. And we had an awful lot of dead and dying. It dropped between 20 and 40 degrees below zero at times. It got so cold, the treads, tank treads froze to the ground. I don't think anyone bled to death. The blood froze as soon as it hit the surface. But we strictly weren't prepared for that bitter a winter.
Here we were just out of a war about 5 years, and we're starting over again in another one. Flew all my Marine missions in support of the troops, close air support along the front lines, napalm, close support with bombs, rockets. In 3 years' time, we lost 53,000 Americans out there. It was called a police action, of course, but it was, for those involved, it was a bloody, bloody war.
The fighting in the Korean War was as ferocious as any seen in World War II. But when the veterans came home, the reception they got was quite different.
In Korea, you went for 12 or 13 months. And at the end of your tour, you were sent home. There were no bands to meet them, no parades or anything like this. The way the American people treated the Korean War and the returning veterans, I think it could be termed the Forgotten War.
I think most Americans did not see the Korean War as a personal threat to themselves and their families. Would it affect the person in the Midwest, someplace in their home and their children? No, it probably would have very little impact on them. So I don't think most Americans saw it as being as important as World War II had certainly been, and so they didn't pay that much attention to it.
On the battlefront, it was frustrating and confusing because it asked the military not to defeat the enemy but to contain him. The concept of total victory was now overshadowed by the specter of nuclear annihilation. For Americans so accustomed to the clarity of goals in World War II, this kind of war was rather baffling. By 1951, the war in Korea had become a bloody stalemate. The commander of the UN forces, the imperious World War II hero General Douglas MacArthur, virtually demanded a free hand to go after the Chinese.
MacArthur's supposed to have wanted to have used 50 atomic bombs against Korea, North Korea, and China, and to lay down a permanent radioactive belt along the Yalu River.
But President Truman would not use the bomb again, and after MacArthur criticized the president and lobbied on to expand the war into China, Truman terminated the general's command and fired him for insubordination. There was a World War II hero at the top of the Republican ticket in 1952. Not MacArthur, but Dwight David Eisenhower.
I accept your summons. I will lead this crusade.
Eisenhower, who had led the Allied invasion of Europe, promised to bring peace to Korea and to quiet the shouting at home. By the spring of 1953, nearly 50,000 Americans had returned home from the Korean War in coffins. People at home continued to wonder how much longer they would have to endure this strange war being fought in a strange land.
I had two brothers who were serving in Korea at the same time. And I was scared to death because I wanted my brothers to come home. And when they came home, it was like, thank you, Lord. Greatest day in the world.
In that summer of 1953, the U.S. finally reached a truce agreement with the North Koreans and the Chinese. And Americans tried to put another war behind them. President Eisenhower had kept his campaign pledge to resolve the Korean conflict. Now he hoped to make America's domestic life his priority.
I believe in the future of the United States of America.
He was going to really take care of the United States. He was going to take care of us personally. And it was a good feeling.
The time was right for Dwight Eisenhower.
One of the things that Ike most wanted to do when he became president was to lower the rhetoric and lower the sense of crisis.
His countrymen were more than ready to relax. With the war over and America bursting with energy, it was time to focus on a more promising future. By 1953, the American people had been dealing with one crisis or another since 1929. The Great Depression, World War II, the Berlin blockade, and then Korea. Eisenhower felt it was now time to turn back the clock to the America of his childhood, a simpler country, where it turned out white males had the last word and where women kept the home fires burning, and the business of America was business. At first, many Americans seemed happy to oblige. But as the decade wore on, Eisenhower and they would discover that not everyone was ready to return to the old way of doing things.